It was meant to be a night of laughter, s'mores, and family bonding until 6-year-old Tyler Granger vanished into the dark woods beyond the flickering bonfire light, never to be seen again. 14 years later, his sister, now grown, stumbles upon something buried in a cold pile of long-extinguished Asheza melted toy, warped by heat, still bearing her brother's name. What she uncovers next sends her spiraling into a truth more horrifying than any campfire tale ever told. The lake was still that evening, its dark surface reflecting the fading blush of sunset as the last light slipped behind the trees. The air was cool with the crispness of early autumn, and the scent of burning cedar curled into the dusky sky. Laughter echoed off the water as the Granger family moved about the clearing beside their lakeside cabin, preparing for the night's Bonfire tradition as old as the cabin itself. Natalie, then only 9, was stacking marshmallows on skewers with her mother while her father wrestled with the fire pit, feeding it dry branches and newspaper until the first flames flickered to life. Tyler, the youngest, zipped through the trees in his dinosaur pajamas, chasing fireflies that blinked like embers in the thickening dusk. He carried a plastic fire truck with him wherever he went, one wheel long since missing, but he clutched it like a lifeline. "Tyler, stay close to the fire," their mother called, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the worry in her voice mild but motherly. "I'm catching the glowing ones," Tyler yelled back, his voice bright and laughing. Natalie remembered turning her head just long enough to answer her dad's joke about burning the marshmallows on purpose. When she looked back, Tyler was gone. At first, no one noticed. The fire cracked cheerfully, and the first s'mores were passed around. It was only when their mother stood up and scanned the yard that the unease began to ripple through the night like a chill wind. "Tyler?" she called again, this time sharper. There was no reply, just the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the low pop of burning wood. Natalie jumped to her feet, scanning the perimeter of firelight. "He was just right there," she insisted, pointing toward the patch of trees near the edge of the lawn. Her dad grabbed a flashlight and swept its beam into the underbrush. They searched, then screamed, then ran into the woods calling his name. The darkness felt suddenly alive, like the trees were pressing in, listening. The flashlight beams trembled in their hands as hours stretched thin and tight. The local police arrived before midnight. Search dogs, thermal cameras, neighbors holding lanterns known of it found a trace of the little boy with the toy fire truck. By dawn, only ashes smoldered in the pit where the fire had once danced, and a silence had settled over the cabin that would never lift. Tyler was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. They kept the fire going through the night, not for warmth but because the thought of letting it die felt too much like surrender. The flames crackled hollow and low, a pale echo of the joy that had burned there only hours earlier. Natalie sat wrapped in a blanket beside her mother, who hadn't said a word since midnight. Her father stood at the edge of the trees, his flashlight cutting through the undergrowth again and again, as if this time it would reveal the place where Tyler had simply slipped out of the world. By 6:00 a.m., the police had arrived in full force. Officer Jenna Myers took Natalie's shaking hand in hers and asked her to tell the story again. "From the start, sweetheart," she said gently. Natalie tried, but the timeline came out like foregone moment. Tyler was there, chasing fireflies, and then he wasn't. No scream, no rustling. Just absence. Volunteers came with flashlights, rakes, dogs. The town of Lake Merrow was small, and when word spread that the Granger boy was missing, people emerged from their warm homes and drove out to the edge of the forest without needing to be asked. Flashlights bobbed like fireflies of their own through the trees. The search dogs barked, then whined, then grew quiet. Nothing. No footprints. Not even Tyler's. They checked the lake first. Divers entered the freezing water at dawn, slicing through the foggy surface like shadows. Natalie clutched her mother's sleeve until her fingers went numb, watching for the smallest sign that they might pull someone out. But the water gave up no secrets. "They always leave something behind," one of the officers muttered, not unkindly. "A shoe, a trail, something. But not this time." By the afternoon, helicopters thumped through the sky, their searchlights raking over the trees and the lake's glassy surface. The woods were combed a dozen times, paths marked with orange tape, coordinates called out over radios. The search map in the back of the patrol van filled with red X's and yellow pins. Still nothing. By the end of the second day, they had to start using the word. Not aloud, not to the family, but in hushed tones behind the cabin, away from Natalie's ears. Abduction. But how? There were no cars, no tire tracks, no reports of strangers. It was as if the darkness itself had reached out and swallowed Tyler whole. And the trees said nothing. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered. Weathered wood, moss on the roofline, and the porch sagging slightly at one corner time had pressed itself into every inch of it. Natalie stood in the gravel drive, the hum of her car's engine still ticking in the cool spring air behind her, wondering how 14 years could pass without healing a single thing. She hadn't been back since that night. None of them had. After weeks of living there during the search, eating from takeout containers and sleeping in clothes, they never unpacked. The Grangers had locked the doors, driven away, and left the place like a museum exhibit, sealed in grief. No one ever said they wouldn't return. They just never did. Now, at 23, Natalie found herself holding the old brass key in her hand, staring at the door as if it might remember her. She took a breath and turned the lock. It groaned like something reluctant to wake. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and pine and distant memory. The furniture remained as it was. The plaid couch with a sunken middle cushion, the wood stove rusted but upright, and a photograph of the three of them before Tyler still framed on the mantel, slightly crooked. But it was the silence that pressed hardest, thick and almost damp, like stepping into a sealed room underground. Natalie moved through the space slowly, touching things as if to remind herself they were real. Her fingers lingered on the window frame where she'd once watched Tyler chase frogs near the lake. There were still scratches in the wood where he'd banged his toy fire truck against it during a tantrum, long before either of them knew how precious that noise would become. Her parents had split 2 years after the disappearance. Her father buried himself in work, moved to Colorado, and stopped calling except on her birthday. Her mother stayed in town but never recovered, drifting through grocery store aisles like a ghost, drinking tea with trembling hands, her eyes always half somewhere else. Natalie had tried to live a normal life. College, friends, a job at a local bookstore, but she always felt like she was walking beside herself, as if the real version of her had never left the woods. She told no one she was coming back here. She wasn't even sure why she had. Maybe she wanted to feel close to Tyler again. Maybe she wanted to say goodbye. Or maybe, just maybe, she needed to ask the cabin what it still remembered. The morning came in slow and gray, wrapped in mist that drifted over the lake like breath. Natalie pulled on her coat and stepped outside, the cabin door creaking shut behind her. The air smelled of moss and cold water, and something else she couldn't name, like old smoke left behind by forgotten stories. She didn't have a plan, just the restless pull that had brought her back here in the first place. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood where they always had, tall and close, their bare branches like ribs against the sky. As a child, she had both loved and feared them. They were wild and deep and whispered at night when the wind pushed through. Now, older and heavier with years, they just felt quiet, waiting. Natalie followed the familiar curve of the property line, her boots sinking into soft ground still wet from yesterday's rain. The lake sat behind her, motionless. She moved without thinking, letting her steps take her wherever they wanted, until she reached the spot. It was subtle at first, just a shift in color. She paused, tilting her head. The earth ahead of her was darker, too dark for spring soil, charred, dry, and dead. She stepped closer, crouching. A wide circle, maybe 6 feet across, had been burned. Not by the campfires they used to make. Those were contained, surrounded by rocks. This was bare, raw, and recent. She touched the dirt. It crumbled dry beneath her fingers. No new growth pushed through, nothing green. And yet no one had used this land in years. The cabin had stood empty, the forest untouched. This shouldn't be here. Natalie stood and turned slowly, scanning the woods. Nothing moved. No birds, no breeze. Just trees, watching with their bare, patient arms. A low shiver worked its way up her spine. She told herself it was just the cold. And then, faintly, she heard it. A sound, a whisper, not words, just breath. Soft, fading. She turned sharply, heart hammering, eyes straining to catch what might be there. Nothing. But the circle was real. The burn was real. Something had been here, and not long ago. Natalie backed away, her pulse loud in her ears. The trees didn't speak, but in that moment they felt aware, like they remembered her. She walked back to the cabin, faster this time, the mist curling at her heels like fingers trying to pull her back. Natalie hadn't meant to come back to the circle, but all day it had tugged at her thoughts like a thread pulling loose. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it, the strange patch of scorched earth, dry in a season too wet for fire. It made no sense, and yet there it was, waiting. The sun was beginning to set again when she returned, the shadows stretching long and thin across the forest floor. The woods were quiet, but not peacefully so quiet, in that tense, expectant way, like a room that hushes just before someone speaks. She knelt slowly at the edge of the blackened soil, where the char gave way to the damp forest floor. It was colder now. She pulled her sleeves over her hands and began to dig gently, sifting through the ash with her fingers. She didn't know what she was looking for, just that she couldn't leave it alone. At first it was nothing but burnt twigs and brittle leaves, their edges curled and flaked. But a few inches down, her hand hit something solid. She paused. Not wood. Plastic. Natalie's breath caught in her throat. Carefully, she scraped away the black layers of ash and dirt until a small, warped shape emerged, a toy. Melted at one end, the red faded to a sickly brown. It was a fire truck, small, child-sized. The front bumper was half missing, and the wheels had fused to the body from heat. Her chest constricted. She turned it over in her hands, and there, etched into the bottom in blocky, uneven letters, was a name. Tyler. She stared at it, not breathing. She remembered the day he wrote it. He'd been so proud of his big boy truck, grinning as he scratched his name into the plastic with a blunt kitchen knife, tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth in concentration. She had scolded him for carving. It told him he'd ruin it, but he just said, "Now nobody can steal it. It's mine forever." That had been 2 weeks before he vanished. Natalie's hands began to shake. She sat back on her heels, the toy cradled in her lap like a relic from a buried past that had never stopped screaming. It shouldn't be here. It had never been found. The police had searched everything. Unless it had come back. Or someone had brought it back. A sound cracked through the trees behind her. A branch maybe. A footstep. She whipped her head around. Nothing. But the fire truck in her hands was warm now, though the ashes had long gone cold. The toy sat on the passenger seat beside her as she drove through town, wrapped loosely in a cloth napkin from the cabin drawer. Natalie had tried not to look at it, but every red light drew her eyes back to the warped plastic and that faint, unmistakable scrawl, Tyler. Even faded and half-melted, it was like seeing his ghost pressed into plastic, proof of a presence that was never supposed to be there. Her mother's house was small and tidy, tucked in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened. The porch light was already on when Natalie pulled into the driveway, though the sun hadn't yet gone down. She didn't knock. She never did. Her mother was in the kitchen, drying dishes in the slow, mechanical way she always had, like her hands needed something to do because her mind was always somewhere else. "I went back to the cabin," Natalie said. Her mother looked up, startled but not surprised. "I figured you might. I found something." Natalie placed the bundle on the table, slowly unfolding it. The fire truck glinted under the overhead light. Its edges bubbled and warped, but the name was still there. Her mother stared at it, the towel in her hands slowly drooping to the floor. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It was in a patch of burnt earth just beyond the clearing," Natalie said. "Not near the fire pit, farther, where the trees begin." Her mother didn't move. Her face had gone pale, eyes locked on the toy, as if it might lurch to life. "We searched everything," she said quietly. "Did we?" Natalie's voice rose. "Because this wasn't found. The police said nothing was left behind. No toys, no prints, not even the scent trail held. But this was in the ground, and not buried for years. The burn was fresh." Her mother sat down heavily, shaking her head. "We searched. They brought dogs, helicopters, everything. But maybe not that spot," Natalie said. Before her mother could answer, the front door opened. Her father's footsteps entered the room with the same briskness they always had, as if any moment of silence had to be filled with movement or noise. "What's going on?" he asked, eyeing them both before spotting the toy on the table. Natalie watched his expression change: recognition, disbelief, and then something colder. His jaw tightened. "That's been gone for years," he said flatly. "I just found it," Natalie replied. "Burned, near the woods, where the search supposedly ended." He picked it up, turned it in his hand. "It doesn't mean anything," he said too quickly. "Maybe someone left it there recently. A prank." "No one knew about this truck except us," Natalie shot back. "He etched his name into it." Her father set the toy down like it had bitten him. "You shouldn't go stirring up ghosts." "I'm not stirring anything," she said, "but someone is." Her mother finally spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "He used to sleepwalk, the week before he disappeared. He said someone was calling him from the trees." Natalie turned sharply to her. "Why didn't you tell the police?" "We didn't think it mattered," her father snapped. "He was a kid. Kids say things." "But he vanished," Natalie said. "And now his toy is back. Something happened out there, and we never asked the right questions." Her mother was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks as she stared at the toy. Her father's face had hardened into stone. No one said another word. But Natalie knew. They weren't telling her everything. It was the kind of discovery that shouldn't have been possible after all this time. The security system at the cabin had been a grainy, motion-triggered camera mounted on the side porch, angled mostly to deter raccoons and the occasional trespasser. Natalie hadn't even remembered it existed until she was digging through a box of mismatched chargers in the cabin's junk drawer and found the old hard drive, caked in dust but intact. She didn't hesitate. She took it home. It took most of the night to get it working. The hardware was old, stubborn, and her laptop didn't recognize the format without a maze of drivers and trial versions of outdated software. But eventually, the screen flickered to life. The interface was clunky, timestamps barely legible, the footage rendered in shaky black and white. She fast-forwarded through hours of nothing, wind in the trees, squirrels darting across the porch, the occasional glare of a firelight reflection off glass. Her eyes burned from the strain, the quiet of her apartment so complete she could hear the electricity in the walls. Then she found it. The date in the corner was barely readable, but the angle was familiar, taken from the porch camera, looking down toward the clearing where the fire pit sat surrounded by folding chairs and laughter. She recognized herself in the frame, smaller, clumsier, Tyler flitting in and out of view like a moth drawn to light. She scrubbed slowly forward, second by second. The timestamp said 7:40, 1 p.m. That was around the time it happened. The moment she always tried to rewind in her memory. Her heart jolted. A figure. Barely visible at first, just a shape at the edge of the woods, cloaked in shadow. Then a flicker of movement. The camera's sensor reacted. The figure stepped slightly into the clearing, enough to be caught by the outer glow of the fire. Hooded. Still. Watching. Natalie froze. The others were laughing. Her father tossed another log into the fire. No one noticed. The hooded man took one slow step forward. Then another. And then, Tyler, just a blur, darted from the edge of the shot running toward the woods. The figure turned, almost lazily, and melted into the trees. The screen went dark. Natalie sat back in her chair, cold creeping into her bones. She replayed it 3 more times. It never changed. No one saw him. No one remembered him. But he was there, watching, waiting. And Tyler had followed him. The basement door had always been off limits. Even when Natalie was a kid, her father had kept it locked with a padlock he claimed was for safety, muttering about faulty steps and exposed wiring. But the truth was, she'd never really questioned it. The cabin was old, and her father liked his secrets. After Tyler disappeared, the door stayed shut, sealed behind grief and years of silence. But now, something gnawed at Hera, rising urgency that whispered there might still be pieces of that night hidden in the dark. It took her an hour to find the key, tucked into the lining of a tool bag in the shed behind the cabin. When the padlock finally clicked open, the sound echoed too loud in the narrow hallway, like something waking up. She opened the door slowly. Dust exploded into the air, thick and sour. A single dangling bulb hung from the low ceiling, the pull string swaying as if disturbed by something other than her breath. She pulled it. Light flickered, held. The basement was small, unfinished, dirt-packed floor, crumbling stone walls, the wooden beams above laced with cobwebs. Her footsteps sounded muffled as she moved down, one hand grazing the rough cement. She didn't notice the footprint at first. It wasn't until she crouched to examine a pile of splintered boxes that she saw it pressed into the dust near the far corner. Small, unmistakably so. The length of it was barely 6 inches, a child's. Natalie knelt down, her heart in her throat. The print was old, but clear. Toes, arch, heel, no shoes. Tyler never liked wearing shoes. Her breath came faster. She looked around, more frantic now, as if some part of him might still be hiding there, behind the rusted shelves or the sagging water heater. Then her eyes found the wall. Scratches. Dozens of them. Low to the ground, clustered near the corner. Some shallow, like hesitant scribbles. Others deeper, frantic, gouging through the old paint and into the soft wood beneath. Natalie stepped closer. She reached out, fingertips trailing along the grooves. They were spaced like fingers, like nails. Her stomach turned. No one had said anything about the basement. No dogs had been brought down here. No one had looked, but someone had been here. And they hadn't left willingly. The old man's name was Conrad Ellery, and his cabin had once sat just 50 yards from the Granger property, half swallowed by the trees. Natalie barely remembered him, just a vague impression of a hunched figure who smoked on the porch and rarely waved. He kept to himself. That's what everyone said afterward. He kept to himself. What most people forgot, or chose not to dwell on, was that Conrad sold his land just weeks after Tyler vanished. Packed up and disappeared like smoke, leaving behind a property stripped down to its bones. The cabin was bulldozed the following year by a real estate developer who later abandoned the project. Locals said it was cursed. Natalie wasn't sure she disagreed. She tracked him down with the help of a librarian named Marlene, who still remembered the sale. His forwarding address led to a weather-stained trailer park 2 towns over, Lot 6. Natalie parked across the gravel road and sat in the car for a minute, staring at the trailer. It looked exhausted, siding warped, screen door hanging crooked on one hinge. The wind whispered through a cluster of dead trees behind it, setting a rhythmless creak to the rusted porch swing. She knocked. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, just as she turned to leave, the door opened a crack. "Who are you?" "Mr. Ellery?" she asked gently. The eye behind the door blinked, narrowed. "Who's askin'?" "I'm Natalie Granger. My family owned the cabin by the lake. Tyler was my brother." The door opened fully. Conrad stood there in a wrinkled shirt and suspenders, gray beard unkempt, eyes sharp despite the sag in his face. "You got nerve coming here after all this time." "I need answers," Natalie said, holding his gaze. "You left right after he went missing. Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back and motioned her inside. The trailer smelled like dust and old smoke. The walls were cluttered with faded clippings, weather reports, and drawings in colored pencil. Most were of trees, the same ones, again and again. "I saw something that night," Conrad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "At the edge of the woods, a man, no flashlight, no coat, just standing there, still as stone." Natalie felt the blood drain from her hands. "I told the police," he continued, "but they said it was probably a hunter, that I imagined it, but I didn't." He pointed to a drawing on the wall trees, and a shadow, long and thin, eyes like empty lanterns. "I left because I knew he'd come back." Conrad's voice dropped lower. "They always do." She found it wedged in the back of a drawer beneath the sink, behind a mess of expired medicine bottles and old receipts. It was bound in blue leather, its edges worn soft from handling, the kind of notebook her mother used to carry around when Natalie was little, always scribbling grocery lists, notes to herself, half-finished recipes. But this one was different. Its pages were stained at the corners, the binding cracked. There was no label, no name. Natalie sat on the cold tile floor and opened it. The handwriting was her mother's, neat at first, then messier the deeper she read. The early entries were dated in the weeks leading up to Tyler's disappearance, mundane thoughts, anxious ramblings about money, her father working too late, Tyler being unusually restless. And then, without warning, the tone shifted. "Tyler was outside again last night. We found him standing barefoot in the backyard at 2:30 a.m., just staring at the trees. Said he was listening." Natalie's fingers tightened on the page. "He keeps saying there's a man in the woods. When I ask what he looks like, he says he's tall and he doesn't blink." A chill climbed her spine. "I don't know if he's imagining things or if he really saw someone, but it's always after the bonfire. Every time. He's not scared. That's what worries me most. He says the man talks to him at night. That he's not allowed to tell me what he says." Natalie turned the page with trembling hands. "I heard Tyler whispering in his room. I thought he was dreaming, but when I opened the door, he turned around and said, 'He said you'll try to stop it. But you can't. It's already started.'" She stopped reading for a moment, staring at the page, heart thudding. These weren't just the fears of a tired mother. These were warnings, clues, things the police had never seen. The last entry was dated the night before Tyler vanished. He was humming at dinner, said tomorrow would be his turn. That the man in the trees was coming, and he was ready now. I tried to press him, but he just smiled and said, "Don't worry, Mommy. You won't even hear me leave." Natalie closed the journal and sat in the silence of the kitchen, the edges of the pages digging into her palms. Her mother had known something was wrong, not just sleepwalking, not just dreams. Tyler had spoken to whatever was waiting in those woods. And somehow, her mother had kept that secret buried for 14 years. Her name was Marcy Elridge, though in the news clippings Natalie found, she was just the girl who came back. 20 years ago, at age 9, Marcy had disappeared from a campground 12 miles north of Lake Merrow. It had been the 4th of July. Her parents had looked away for 10 minutes while packing up coolers and folding chairs. When they turned back, she was gone. 3 days later, she emerged from the forest barefoot and bloodied, her arms scratched to ribbons, eyes wide with something no one could name. She never spoke publicly about what happened. Her family moved shortly after, and the story faded into something parents whispered when their children wandered too far from the trail. But Natalie remembered. It took a week of digging, old phone directories, and dead-end Facebook profiles. But she finally found her Marcy, now living under her married name in a rural farmhouse 2 counties over, off a dirt road that hadn't seen pavement in decades. The house was old, the paint worn to gray, and a wind chime of bones swayed gently from the porch. Marcy answered the door like she'd been expecting her. "You're Granger's girl," she said without preamble. "The boy who vanished at the lake." Natalie nodded. "I found your name in an old article. I think something took my brother the same way it took you." Marcy looked her over for a long time, then stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled of sage and dust. The walls were cluttered with map-drawn detailed sketches of forests, clearings, patterns etched in strange, looping symbols. Natalie followed Marcy into a room that felt more like a bunker than a living space. Shelves of journals, binders labeled in red ink, clippings, string, tape. "You're not the first to come looking," Marcy said. "But most stop when the trees don't give up anything." She pulled a rolled piece of parchment from the shelf and spread it on the table. It was a map of the Lake Merrow woods, but not just trails and landmarks. This one was marked with dates, events, shapes that looked like runes carved in flame. One circle in particular had been circled in black dozens of times, the ink soaked through. "That's where I came out," Marcy said, "and where he followed me." Natalie stared at the map, her voice a whisper. "Who?" Marcy's eyes didn't blink. "The burned man." Marcy sat cross-legged on the floor beside the map, her hands resting in her lap, but her shoulders were tense, braced, like someone preparing to be hurt. Natalie sat across from her, notebook forgotten in her lap, the silence between them stretched thin. "I don't talk about it," Marcy said finally, voice low. "Not because I've forgotten, because when I remember too clearly it comes back." Natalie waited, not pushing. She knew the weight of silence, knew how long it could linger after a person vanished. Marcy looked up, her eyes hollow and glassy. "It started with a voice, not one I heard out loud. I felt like smoke in my lungs. It told me to go into the trees, just a few steps, that's all, but it was enough." She pulled a faded photograph from a manila folder beside her. Natalie leaned forward. It showed a ring of stones in a forest clearing, crude symbols burned into the ground around it. They curled like hooks and branches, jagged and alive. "They called it a place of return," Marcy said. "I don't know who they were, not really. I never saw faces, just robes, shadows, but one of them was different." Her fingers twitched as she traced one of the symbols in the photo. "He watched me," she whispered. "Not like a person, like something that hadn't had eyes in a long time and forgot how to use them. He smelled like burnt meat and ash. His skin, if that's what it was, looked melted, and he never spoke with a mouth, just inside my head." Natalie's stomach turned, but she didn't look away. "He made me stay in the ring, said I had to listen to the quiet, said if I moved before the fire picked me, I'd never leave the woods." "How did you get out?" Natalie asked, voice barely audible. Marcy smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I stopped listening." She pointed to a scar on her thigh, half moon-shaped, like a bite. "I think I broke something when I ran, maybe a rule, maybe just myself, but I crawled for what felt like days, and when I opened my eyes, I was back at the campground. They thought I was dead." Natalie stared at the photo again, at the burned ground, the echo of a ritual. "I think your brother stayed," Marcy said quietly, "and if that fire's lit again, he might still be waiting." The room felt colder then, like the trees had leaned in, just a little closer. Natalie sat cross-legged on the floor of the town archive, a pale pool of desk lamplight spreading across a sea of yellowing newspaper clippings. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully, as if turning the pages too quickly might wake something old and cruel. Her laptop screen blinked with a spreadsheet columns labeled name, age, date missing, location, witness reports. 5 rows, 5 children. And all of them were gone. Each story was heartbreakingly similar. A family outing, a rural cabin, a summer night, a bonfire. The names had faded in local memory, buried under years and the quiet ache of unspoken conclusions. They must have wandered off, must have fallen in the lake, must have been taken by someone passing through. But none had ever been found. No remains, no trails, just the firelight, and then absence. There was Julian Hicks, age 8, who vanished from a campground in Sycamore Hills during a 4th of July celebration in 1983. His mother claimed she'd seen him just moments before, dancing around the flames, waving sparklers in each hand. He was never seen again. Then Marissa Kent, 6, gone from her grandparents' backyard near Elkwood in 1989. Her father had lit a bonfire to keep away the mosquitoes. She was there 1 minute, gone the next. And there were others. Toby Lynn, 7, Danielle Vargas, 9, Timothy Rhodes, 5. All vanished during or just after bonfires. All within a 50-mile radius of Lake Merrow. Natalie leaned back in her chair, eyes aching, heart thudding. It couldn't be coincidence. There were too many parallels, same geography, same circumstances, same season. And every one of them had been dismissed. Wandering children, bad luck, wild animals. But Natalie knew what it really was now. The fire wasn't just a background detail, it was the invitation. Her phone buzzed beside her, a text from her mother. Still not sleeping. Something feels wrong tonight. Please call me when you can. Natalie stared at the message for a long time. Then she looked back at the clippings spread before her 5 children. 5 stories unfinished. And now, Tyler. She felt it like pressure in her chest, like smoke rising before the blaze. There was something beneath this town, beneath the soil and roots and ash, something that came to the firelight, waiting. Not random, not gone. Taken, always taken. His name was Walter Heron, and he smelled like old ash and peppermint lozenges. Natalie met him at a coffee shop on the edge of town, one of those places that hadn't changed since the 70s brown vinyl booths, clinking mugs, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in a decade. He wore a faded fire department jacket over a flannel shirt, and his hands shook slightly as he sipped his black coffee, but his eyes were steady. "You're the girl looking into the lake, kid," he said, not as a question. "Tyler Granger." Natalie nodded, unsure how word had spread so fast. He gave a grim sort of smile. "Back then, we didn't have much to do most days. Couple chimney fires, the occasional cabin electrical issue, but summers were strange." He pulled out an envelope from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. Inside were photo-shard clearings, blackened stone rings, fire pits bigger than any backyard bonfire should have ever been. "You recognize any of these places?" he asked. Natalie swallowed and nodded toward one. "That's near Lake Merrow." Walter tapped it with a gnarled finger. "That one took Julian Hicks, 8 years old. Vanished during a cookout in '83. We responded to a call about a fire burning out of control in the woods. By the time we got there, it was ash, and the boy was gone." She studied the next photo, another blackened circle in the dirt, a toy car half melted in the frame. Walter watched her carefully. "They always said it was animals, a bear maybe, or that the kids just wandered off. But I've walked those woods 100 times, and I've never seen a bear leave no tracks. And kids don't just evaporate." He leaned in, voice lowering. "There were 5 of them, 5 fires, 5 kids, different towns, but always the same story. No witnesses, no sign of struggle, and always near these massive bonfires. Like someone was calling something." Natalie's heart pounded. "You tried to tell people?" Walter gave a humorless chuckle. "Tried. Got told I was chasing ghost stories. One of my captains warned me to drop it, or risk early retirement. I dropped it." He looked out the window, his expression distant. "But I never forgot the smell. That wasn't just wood burning in those fires. It was something older, something wrong." Natalie didn't speak. She didn't need to. She could smell it now, too. The call came at 2:13 a.m., the kind of hour that doesn't just wake you, it drags you from something deeper. Natalie sat up in bed before the phone even rang a second time, heart already racing. The darkness of her apartment stretched too wide, too quiet. She didn't recognize the number, no name, no location. Just 7 digits, and a cold, sinking certainty that whoever was on the other end wasn't calling by accident. She answered without thinking. At first, there was nothing, just static low, thin like wind whispering through dead leaves. Then, a voice. Distorted, slurred, like it was speaking through a bad speaker underwater. "You found the truck," it said. Natalie's mouth went dry. She couldn't speak. "He remembers you," it continued, barely above a breath. "The girl who made him laugh." There was a flicker of sound, something like a child's voice, distant, muffled, almost humming. Then more static. Natalie finally found her voice. "Who is this?" Silence. "Who are you?" A pause. Then the voice returned, closer now. "He waits for fire. And you're close again." Click. The line went dead. She stared at the phone in her hand, fingers trembling. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. She stood up, crossed to the window, and yanked the curtain aside. Nothing but street lamps and empty asphalt. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not the paranoid kind, but the thick, certain kind, like someone was already inside, standing just behind her, waiting to be seen. She looked down at the phone again, the call log still glowing. The number was gone. Not blocked, not unknown. Gone. Natalie paced the room, breathing hard, trying to make sense of the voice. It wasn't Tyler. She'd know his voice, even if it had been buried in her mind for 14 years. But the words. He remembers you. How could he? And who was speaking for him? She opened the drawer where she'd stored the fire truck, wrapped now in cloth and kept like a relic. Slowly, she unwrapped it. The plastic felt cold in her hand, heavier than it should have. The name Tyler was still visible beneath the melt. And for a moment, just a breath of one, she swore she smelled smoke, not just any smoke. The same kind from that night. Thick, sweet, wrong. The forest swallowed the sound of her footsteps. Each step into the undergrowth was like stepping backward in time, away from the crunch of gravel roads and phone signals and certainty. Natalie moved slowly, the crude hand-drawn map folded in her coat pocket, memorized long before she crossed the boundary of where the trees grew too close and the air grew too still. Marcy had been clear. You'll know it when you feel it, like the woods are holding their breath. And now they were. The path was barely visible, overgrown with ivy and years of silence. But something guided her, whether memory or instinct, she didn't know. She followed the slope of the land, the way it dipped between two crooked pines like a scar. The deeper she went, the colder it became. Not wind cold, not seasonal, a still, dead cold. The kind that hadn't changed in decades. Then she saw it. The trees opened into a clearing too round to be natural. The earth was blackened in patches, the remnants of fires long extinguished. The ash fused into hardened spirals. At the center sat a ring of stones, 12 of them each, scorched, pitted, and cracked. Time hadn't worn them down, fire had. Natalie stepped into the circle, her boots pressing into the brittle char. Her breath fogged in the air, though it wasn't cold enough for it. Something was wrong with the space here, like gravity tilted sideways. And then she saw the drawings. Etched into the stone and scratched into the trees were childlike markings. Stick figures holding hands, circles filled with jagged teeth, tall, spindly shapes looming over smaller ones. One drawing on the bark of a dying maple made her blood run cold. A group of children around a fire, and something tall beside it, its head haloed in flame. She crouched beside one of the stones, fingertips brushing over the soot-darkened surface. There was a symbol there, half buried in mosswoe, intersecting circles with a triangle in the center. It matched the one in Marcy's journal, the one she'd labeled Threshold. The ground hummed beneath her. Not loud, not even audible, just a vibration she felt in her ribs, the way you might feel thunder before you hear it. Natalie stood slowly, heart hammering. The air smelled faintly of smoke. Old, ancient. She wasn't alone here. Not anymore. The ash gave way too easily. Natalie hadn't planned to dig. She'd only come back to the clearing to mark coordinates, maybe take photos, proof that what she'd seen yesterday wasn't some twisted dream brought on by exhaustion and grief. But something about the air today felt different. Thicker, sharper, like the trees were leaning closer. Her boot struck something soft just beneath the crust of scorched earth near the ring of stones. Not a root, not rock, something lighter. She crouched down and began to clear the top layer away with her hands. The ash clung to her fingers, blackened her nails, filled her nose with that sour, sweet scent of burned things long buried. A few inches down, her hand brushed paper warped, stained, but intact. She held her breath. One page, then another, then a small stack bound with twine and care. Crayon. Lined notebook paper. A child's handwriting. The first page was a drawing crude stick figures under a sky of gray scribbles. A figure taller than the others loomed over them, arms long, head a black circle with orange lines radiating from it like fire. He watches us when the fire goes out. Her heart seized. The next page was all words, crooked and misspelled, some letters written backward the way young children do. But the name was clear. Tyler. Natalie clutched the stack tighter. He said he is not a man, he is a place. He lives in the cold light. He says I can stay forever if I stop talking to the sky. She flipped another page. The crayon was pressed hard into the paper, as if he'd been angry or scared or trying to make someone listen. The tall burned man lives in the trees when the fire goes out. He doesn't like singing. I heard Mommy singing once, and he made her stop in my dream. He doesn't blink. Natalie sat back on her heels, the diary resting in her lap like something radioactive. Her throat burned, eyes stinging with smoke or tears, she couldn't tell which. These weren't dreams. They were memories. Page after page, Tyler's voice bled through the childish scrawl speaking of a place beyond the woods, where time didn't move right, where whispers never stopped, where the sky stayed dark even when the sun was out. He says, fire is the door. If I leave, he will burn my name out of the world. The last page was smudged with dirt and something darker. A drawing of a girl stick thin, standing beside a boy with the name Tyler etched above his head in red. Next to them was the tall burned man, and in his hand he held a key. The woodpile looked almost identical to the one from that night-split logs stacked like bones. The fire pit rimmed with smooth stones, old and stained black from years of forgotten summers. Natalie stood in the center of the clearing with the last light of day slipping behind the trees, her breath catching in the cool dusk air. Everything was in place. A spark, and the fire would burn. Her fingers trembled as she struck the match. She hadn't told her parents right away. She knew what they would say. But the moment she unfolded Tyler's crayon-filled diary in front of them, his strange, broken descriptions of a man who wasn't a man, a place that wasn't real, they'd both gone pale. Her mother wept in silence. Her father left the room and didn't come back for an hour. When she told them her plan, her mother gripped her wrist with fingers that had once soothed nightmares and now trembled like dying leaves. "You're not going to bring him back," she said, voice cracking. "Whatever took him, whatever that thing is, it's not something you can reason with." "I'm not trying to reason," Natalie replied. "I'm trying to make it show itself." Her father had been quieter, more brittle. "You're playing with something that doesn't play fair," he said. "That fire burned him out of this world. Don't give it another chance." But she couldn't stop. The fire was the door. The diary had said so. The others, Marcy, the missing children, the rings of scorched stone, they all led to this. As the flame caught, dry twigs snapped and hissed, orange licking the air like a tongue tasting the space around it. The smoke twisted up between the branches overhead. It wasn't warm. It should have been, but it wasn't. Natalie stepped back, her arms wrapped tight around herself. Shadows danced in the tree line, long and thin. She waited. Minutes passed. The forest stayed still. Then something. A shape. There, just beyond the reach of the firelight, no sound, no movement. But it was there, watching. The flames crackled higher, hungry now. Natalie didn't run. She whispered the name from the journal. The tall burned man. A low hum, like wind through hollow wood, answered her. And in the dark between the trees, something took a step forward. The fire roared like it remembered what it was for. Flames reached higher than they should have, fed by nothing Natalie could see, just dry wood and a single match, yet it burned as if fueled by something beneath the earth. The heat shimmered, but the air stayed cold, too cold. The forest had gone deathly still. Not a bird, not a breeze, not even the distant hum of night insects. Just the crackle of fire and her own breath, shallow and ragged. Then, from the trees, something moved. It wasn't fast. No rush, no sudden jolt. Just a slow, stumbling emergence, like a figure unsure if it was meant to be seen. Natalie took a step back. her hands clenched into fists. She told herself not to blink. A boy stepped into the firelight. Thin, dirty, barefoot. Natalie froze. His clothes were too small, clinging to his frame like fabric had forgotten how to fit a body. His hair hung in tangled tufts, a dull rusted brown that once glowed copper in the sun. His face was pale, drawn, hollowed by something time couldn't explain. But it was him. Tyler. Her brother. Tyler? She whispered, the word barely sound, more shape than voice. He didn't answer. He looked around as if confused by the world he'd entered, eyes flickering from tree to fire to her, pausing with quiet uncertainty. Those eyes, still blue, but darker somehow. Like they'd watched stars go out. He took another step forward, trembling, as if his legs remembered how to walk but not how to stand. His lips parted. "Natalie?" The word cracked from his throat like something broken open. She was already running. She reached him before she realized what she was doing, dropping to her knees in the ash and wrapping her arms around him. His body was rigid at first, then sagged into hers with a low, shuddering breath. "I looked for you," she choked. "I looked everywhere." His voice was smaller now, a whisper against her neck. "I waited." She pulled back just enough to look at him. His cheeks were wet, whether from her tears or his, she couldn't tell. "I didn't know how to get out," he said, but the fire opened the door again. Behind them, the flames died abruptly, like exhaling. The woods remained silent, but something was gone. And something had returned. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and false hope. Pale green walls, soft shoes squeaking on linoleum. Natalie sat by the window, hands clasped so tightly in her lap the knuckles had gone white. Tyler was in the bed across from her, small against the expanse of it, eyes fixed on the ceiling like he expected it to speak. He hadn't said much since that night. Doctors moved in and out like ghosts, all careful hands and clipped whispers. They ran tests, drew blood, measured reflexes and brain activity, but no one had answers. Only questions, stacking on top of one another like damp wood refusing to burn. He was 20, a man by every medical standard, but he didn't know what year it was, didn't know how to write his last name. When asked his birthday, he said, "I think it's near the fire again." He still spoke in crayon logic. "I lived where the light couldn't go," he told one nurse, eyes wide and unblinking. "They told me if I made noise, the shadows would come inside me." Natalie tried not to cry when he said things like that. He remembered her but only pieces. The way her laugh sounded through the cabin door, her voice telling him stories about fire trucks and dinosaurs. He called her Sissy, the way he had before he disappeared. It was like the years in between had curled up, blackened, and burned out of his mind. The therapists were careful with their words. Developmental arrest, cognitive freeze, dissociative memory loss. But what they all meant was simpler. Tyler's body had aged, but time hadn't touched the boy inside. "What do you remember?" Natalie asked him gently one evening as they watched the rain against the window. He turned to her slowly, the hospital blanket pulled up around his shoulders. "There was a place," he whispered. "A long hallway made of trees. The lights were cold, like moonlight, but they hurt. I couldn't see walls, just fire on the ground. And voices. They told me not to run, or he'd hear." "Who?" He looked at her, like it should be obvious. "The burned man." Natalie swallowed hard, reaching for his hand. "Did you ever see him?" Tyler nodded. "But only when I disobeyed." Outside, thunder rolled low across the hills. And Natalie wondered how long it would take to unlearn everything the fire had taught him. The walls in the interview room were soft blue, meant to soothe. A digital clock ticked steadily in the corner, counting time that Tyler didn't seem to know he'd lost. Natalie sat behind a two-way mirror, her fists clenched beneath the table. She hadn't wanted to let him do this. Hypnosis sounded too much like a trick, too close to the kind of magic that had already taken her brother for 14 years, but the psychologist had been kind, deliberate, and Tyler had agreed. "If it helps Sissy," he said. So they let him try. He sat in the center of the room now, curled slightly in the chair, eyes fluttering closed under the slow rhythm of the therapist's voice. His fingers twisted in his lap like he was still clutching something that had been taken from him. "Tyler," the therapist said softly, "I want you to go back, to where you were before Natalie found you. What do you see?" A long pause. Then Tyler spoke. "It's dark." His voice was hollow, thin, not frightened but flat, like he'd gone somewhere far away. "Good. And what else?" "There are stairs," he whispered, "made of dirt. They go down forever. My feet get cold." Natalie pressed her hand against the glass, not even realizing she'd moved. "Are you alone?" "No." He swallowed. "They're there. The ones in the robes. But they don't talk. Only he talks. He doesn't have to move his mouth." "Who is he, Tyler?" "The burned man." His voice cracked on the word like he'd bitten glass. "What does he say to you?" Tyler's brow furrowed, his head tilted slightly, as though listening again. "He says the fire picked me because I listened. He says I'm special because I stopped singing. He says Natalie is next." The air in the observation room snapped cold. "He said she would join me soon, after the sky forgets her name." The therapist leaned forward slightly. "What do the rooms look like, Tyler?" "Candlelight," he murmured. "But it's wrong. It flickers backward. There's writing on the walls, circles that spin when I blink." He began to shiver. "I want to wake up now." The therapist gave the signal, and moments later, Tyler stirred, his eyes wide and wet with confusion. "Did I say something bad?" Natalie couldn't move. The burned man had never truly let him go. And now, he wanted her too. Natalie couldn't sleep, not since the interview, not since the words, "she would join me soon," started echoing inside her skull like a curse whispered through a keyhole. She had sat with Tyler afterward, stroked his hair while he hummed tunelessly under his breath, still caught between that underground place and the bright, unfamiliar hospital lights. But even as she held his hand, her thoughts kept drifting, spiraling back to the same place they always avoided. Her father. It started with questions, little things. Why hadn't he insisted the basement be searched when Tyler vanished? Why had he never mentioned the old security footage? Why had it been left to rot in a drawer for over a decade? And the journal, how could her mother's entries have gone unnoticed? Or worse, ignored? She drove to their house after midnight, gravel spitting under her tires as she pulled up the long driveway. The windows glowed low, her father's study, still lit. He hadn't slept much since Tyler came back. But when Natalie entered the house and stepped into the study, she didn't find grief in his face. She found fear. He looked up slowly, glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. Behind him, a fire crackled in the hearth, too hot for spring, too intentional. His eyes were red, not from drink, but from years of things he never said. "You knew," Natalie said quietly. He didn't respond. "You knew something was wrong before Tyler disappeared. You knew he was sleepwalking, talking about someone in the woods. Mom wrote it all down." "I didn't think it meant anything," he muttered. "No," she said. "You did. That's why you locked the basement. That's why you stopped letting him outside alone. But when he vanished, you didn't tell them everything. Why?" His hands were shaking now. He reached for the whiskey but missed. "I thought it was just stories, imagination. I didn't believe it until it was too late." "You saw him, didn't you?" Her father flinched. "I thought it was a dream," he said, voice cracking. "The night before Tyler disappeared, I woke up and saw something watching through the trees, tall, burning. Not real. It couldn't be real." Natalie's voice was ice. "And you never told anyone?" He stared into the fire, and the flames reflected in his eyes like memory. "I thought if I kept it quiet, it would stop looking." He looked up at her, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. But it never stopped. The documents were brittle with age, tucked inside a weathered file box buried deep in the back corner of the town library's restricted archive. Natalie had found them by accident, chasing a reference in an old local history book about the burned circles that sometimes appeared in the Ember Lake region during the late 1800s. Most were dismissed as wildfires or lightning strikes, but one line stood out, linked, some believed, to the vanished congregation of Rekindle. Rekindle. She dug for hours, the dust clinging to her skin, the smell of old paper thick in the air. When she finally pried open the forgotten box marked 1870 to 1920, religious descent, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, wrapped in twine, were pamphlets, meeting notes, and testimonies from frightened towns, pieces of something dark that no one had dared to talk about for generations. They called themselves the Children of Rekindle, a splinter sect of an old revivalist church that had once stood near Ember Lake, just northeast of Lake Merrow. They'd believed that fire wasn't punishment, but passage. That within flame lived something ancient, something that could cleanse the flesh, but preserve the soul. Some called it metaphor, others whispered it was literal. In one scrawled journal entry, a woman named Isadora Voss wrote, "He came to us when the bonfire reached its peak, his face a mask of ember, his voice not heard, but felt. The children who walked into the flame did not scream, they transcended, they were chosen." Natalie's fingers trembled as she flipped through the brittle pages. Several local children had vanished during that time, each disappearance coinciding with a Rekindle gathering. Townspeople eventually turned on the group. The church was burned to the ground in 1919 under mysterious circumstances. The leaders disappeared. Some said they'd fled. Others said they'd gone willingly into the fire, following their God into the next world. One newspaper clipping had a photograph of the original congregation, men and women in simple robes, standing in front of a massive bonfire, and at the center, standing behind them all, was a tall figure cloaked in soot, his face obscured entirely by a scorched veil. The caption read, "Rekindle's Shepherd." The same figure from Tyler's drawings. Natalie pressed the page flat, her heart pounding. The cult hadn't died. It had simply gone quiet. And now, it was calling again. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the den. Outside, the woods creaked with wind, their black silhouettes pressed against the glass like watchers who never slept. Natalie sat on the edge of the couch, Tyler's diary open on her lap, but her eyes were on her father. He stood by the fire, whiskey glass untouched in his hand, the weight of silence pressing down like a second gravity. "I know what you did," she said, voice low but certain. "I found the records, the children of Rekindle. You were approached." He didn't turn to face her. For a long time he didn't move at all. "I thought it was nonsense," he said finally. "Old campfire stories. They said they were part of some preservationist circle. Wanted access to the land near the lake, said they held seasonal ceremonies, bonfires, singing, tradition." "And you said no?" Natalie guessed. "I laughed in their faces," he muttered, "told them to take their robes and get off my porch." The fire popped. And then Tyler started sleepwalking. He turned now, slowly. There was something hollow in his eyes, like part of him had been burned out and never grown back. "They left drawings," he said. "Chalk symbols on our porch. A doll made of twigs, with his name written on it, tied to our front gate. I thought it was just some twisted prank." But he started talking in his sleep, started drawing those same symbols. He said someone was visiting him at night, said a man made of fire was teaching him to be still in the flame. Natalie's nails dug into her palms. "Why didn't you tell the police?" "I was scared," he whispered. "Not of them, of what they could make him believe, that he belonged to something else, that he didn't need us." He turned back toward the fire, voice dropping. "One night, they came again, 3 of them. I never saw their faces, just hoods. They said I had a choice, join them, let Tyler be initiated, or they'd take him anyway." His shoulders crumpled. "And I still said no." Natalie's throat ached. Then he vanished. Her father nodded slowly. "I thought I was protecting him. But I should have screamed. I should have burned the whole forest down before I let them touch him." He looked back at her, eyes wet. "They said fire would bring him home." The flames behind him roared, as if remembering. She returned to the clearing just before dusk, Tyler's hand folded tightly in hers. The path had grown over again, as if the forest was trying to erase what had happened there, but Natalie remembered every step. The way the trees leaned too close, the way the light thinned, the way the earth felt wrong beneath her boots, hollow as an old grave. They stood at the center of the ritual ground, the ring of scorched stones still there, though half swallowed by moss and time. The ash was dry, waiting. The wind had died. Tyler didn't speak. He hadn't said much since the hypnosis. But he didn't let go of her hand. Natalie knelt at the center and opened her bag. One by one, she laid the drawings he'd made as a child found beneath ash, smeared and soot into the dirt. The stick figures, the circles, the long shadow with fire for a face. She pressed them flat against the blackened ground. Then she scattered the salt. She wasn't sure why Marcy had mentioned it once, in a whisper, as if it were a superstition passed from one survivor to another. Salt to break the tether, to sever the circle, to make sure nothing came back through. Tyler stepped away, watching from the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide but unblinking. Natalie struck the match. The fire took quickly, too quickly. It devoured the paper like it had been starving, flames climbing in thin, furious tongues, the drawings twisted, curled, and blackened. The salt crackled beneath the heat. Smoke poured into the sky, thick and dark. And then the screams began. They didn't come from the fire. They came from the trees. High and wailing, not human, not animal, something older, stretched too far, voices warped by time and pain. The sound made Tyler flinch, his hands over his ears. Natalie stood her ground, eyes locked on the blaze. Tears streaked her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I see you," she said. "I know what you are. You don't get to keep him." The flames surged higher. The screams peaked. And then, as suddenly as they'd begun, they stopped. Silence fell. The fire hissed down to embers. The trees stood still. Tyler came to her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "Is it over?" he asked, voice small. She didn't answer right away. "It's quieter," she said. "That's enough for now." And together they watched the past burn down to ash.